Welcome to the second session of our 5 years in the Legacy of the Arab Spring meeting. So now we will deal with a slightly different subject. We'll look at the physical destruction and prospects for reconstruction, and we will analyze the physical toll incurred by 5 years of violent turmoil. So I don't want to spend too much time on the bios. I will briefly introduce the four speakers. We have changed the schedule a little bit just to make it unpredictable. Hey, why not? So Marwa Daoudy, who's the Assistant Professor of International Relations at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, will be first. Then it will be Erika Weinthal, who's the Lee Hill Snowdon Professor of Environment Policy and unfortunately also an Associate Dean. I know what that means. My sympathies. Then Nadim Khouri, who's an independent researcher on food security, presently supporting the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program and a multi-agency investment initiative hosted at the World Bank. And then finally, Rich Cincotta, who's a former Wilson Center, who's a Wilson Center Global Fellow with the Center's Environmental Change and Security Program, and also the director of the Global Political Demography Program at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. Now, Erika and Rich Cincotta have PowerPoints, so when they do their thing, I'm going to disappear so you can see it. Marwa, please start.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Henri, for inviting me, and for Kendra for the logistics, and for the Woodrow Wilson Center for inviting me and being part of this very interesting day and discussion. Physical destructions, a Middle East perspective. Of course, the physical destructions concern the focal areas of conflict, which are Syria, Libya, Yemen, and indirectly, of course, other parts of the Middle East where the Arab Spring emerged. However, I will focus mainly on the Syrian conflict and its impact on the neighboring countries. And when I'll tackle physical destructions, I look also not only at infrastructures, but I'll also look at the destruction at the human capital level, which is very important, and show how pessimistic one can be. And I'll bring figures, unfortunately, and some data about that. But I'll hope to end with some more optimistic note about the reconstruction, which is the other side of the panel, the other topic, and seeing possibly what are the prospects for reconstruction and reconciliation as well. And as I said, at the heart of it, the Middle East perspective in the title for me is to look at the impact of these destructions for Syria and Syrians first and foremost, and how later on and in the process it has also impacted other countries and other populations, of course. So the war in Syria destroyed the physical infrastructures, the factories, the power plants, housing. But also we've seen a phenomenon of what one could refer to as human de-development. A huge loss of human, economic, and cultural capital in Syria, and we had over lunch an introduction from a UNESCO perspective on the cultural sites which were destroyed, and this is adding another layer to the tragedy which continues to unfold in Syria. Usually, the perspective on these destructions and the ensuing insecurities that spread throughout the region are often framed from a Western security perspective, and mainly from the refugee crisis perspective. We've had also a discussion this morning about ISIS, and all of these issues are important. However, I think it's important to relocate the debate and to think that the first victims of the conflict are the populations in the region, and they're also the first victims of terrorism and ISIS. And in that sense, if one looks at population displacement, the recent shellings in Aleppo, just to give you a figure, Aleppo has lost already more than 3 million of its residents out of 5 who fled. There is increasing poverty, insecurities at societal level, for example, the situation of women refugees in hosting countries who are put at higher risks, and also a huge gap in education. And I'll get to that in a little while. So if we look at the numbers, the loss to Syrian economy is estimated by UN ESQA, an agency based in Beirut, Lebanon, at 140 billion USD. The World Bank has estimated the reconstruction to cost 200 billion USD. And we're speaking now 5 years on. We might be speaking again in 5 years, and the toll would have increased. 50% of the population in Syria has been affected by displacement. 32% in Aleppo, 20% of Damascus countryside, 12% of Homs, 2 million damaged residences. Homs is completely destroyed. Major parts of Aleppo are also destroyed. And here we're speaking again about the societal, the economic, but also the cultural level. The estimates are the economy in Syria has brought back the country more than 30 years ago. We're back to the 1980s level. The GDP has decreased by 40%, according to IMF estimates. Considering that in 2010, Syria's GDP was higher than Jordan's and Tunisia's, and Syria ranked favorably on human development indicators such as health and education. Of course, it ranked very poorly on other indicators, such as political freedom, freedom of expression, and this is an issue that needs to be tackled also in the reconstruction period. Now we have a generation in Syria of young people with disrupted education. 1.2 million are living in extreme poverty, and more than 2.3 million have become poor in the process of the last 5 years. And I'm basing this on estimates done by a program called the National Agenda for the Future of Syria, which is based at Esqa in Lebanon. Inside the country, let's go back to the physical destructions. The schools have been targeted by the regime and more recently by the Russian shellings in Aleppo. This means also that in the war effort, a lot of the state resources have been redirected away from education towards arming, of course, buying weapons, and also paying salaries for the militiamen and for the army. And that has also resulted in poor attendance rates for the children and the young teenagers in the country, and a very sharp deterioration of education when the country used to rate quite highly within the Arab world. I want to highlight that the situation is not only concerning inside Syria, it's also very relevant for refugee children in hosting countries. In Lebanon, in Jordan, half of the children don't go to school, and often there are issues with the curriculum. There are issues also of hosting the children in already, overwhelmed schools. And there's a money put by international organizations, but it's not really seeping into the system. From what I've seen in a recent trip to Lebanon, where many of the children are still out of school. So we're speaking about future generations. What about the sanctions? Well, they have targeted the oil and the banking systems. And in addition, ISIS capture of oil fields in the eastern part of the country is not helping, of course, the economic situation. The oil exports have dropped to zero. The oil production was cut to half. But the regime is still getting oil and subsidies from Iran, as we know, and again, diverting the resources away from the population and cutting down on subsidies. Just for the information, Iran offered 2 credit lines totaling 4.6 billion to pay for imports of energy and wheat, and Moscow has forgiven some of its debt to help the regime to consolidate its base. And we know also the role, it was mentioned the previous panel, of external actors, such as, Gulf countries helping also the opposition group in that sense. And all of that, external intervention is clearly not helping the situation. The inflation rose from about 4% in 2010 to 120%. What is happening also is the rise of an informal war economy, which is burgeoning, and possibly also explaining why the conflict is protracted. Checkpoint bribes, fees to secure the release of prisoners, looting by pro-regime militiamen, etc., etc. Now, what about the reconstruction? Well, the forecasts are the following. The country will take 40 to 50 years to recover. And this is based on a very interesting source. All of these sources are also Syrian economists and analysts who are providing the data. The Syria report, for example, is forecasting 40 to 50 years. Others are saying a decade. I think it will take more time. And of course, this is feeding into insecurities and the rise of radicalism and grievances. We often read accounts that Syria is worse off than Germany after the Second World War. And of course, the economic recovery that Germany went through was very much held by a Marshall Plan, and that's a reflection that at some point the reconstruction plan should envisage, but a real Marshall Plan in the sense for economic recovery and not for, outsourcing contracts and, taking advantage of the transition. So it's being prepared actively. There are reports which are drafted, analyses which are made, but the estimates, again, $140 billion, which would be needed for that. The economy is important. The social dimension is crucial as well. There will be the need for human capital, and I've mentioned the loss of human capital in the last 5 years. Many parts of the population are abroad, as you know, either as refugees in the neighboring countries, and the ones who are inside still will be illiterate in the future generations because they have no access to schools or they're not going to school. Sectarianism has added another feature to the conflict, and we know, and I think it's important to stress out that this was not the source of the conflict, that it's become a driver, but it's not the source of the conflict. And clearly there will be the need to mend, reconciliate, and bring the parties together, but also a political solution as part of this reconstruction, which will address war crimes and justice and accountability to allow for a viable reconstruction. Otherwise, we will be just focusing on peace and not justice. Interestingly, the war has also clearly destroyed the physical infrastructures, but also the business networks. Many businessmen have left the country with their capital, their knowledge, and their networks. Paradoxically, they have also benefited other countries, and often we read and we discuss the impact of the Syrian war on other countries in the region, the negative impact, the weight, being incurred by the refugees, etc. Well, it's interesting to read also to know that the disruption of trade routes happened, of course, tourism and financial flows have been severely impacted in Lebanon and Jordan, and also they have also incurred the weight of the 1.7 million refugees which are distributed between the two countries. It's also important to outline that the Syrians rank amongst the top investors in these regional countries. They are the fourth amongst the major investors in the United Arab Emirates. They're the first in Lebanon in the real estate sector. There are 30,000 investors in Egypt, and Turkey clearly has been struck in terms of its economy because there was a massive decline of trade with Syria after 2011, knowing that Syria was the entry point for Turkey after the AKP government came to power, entry point for trade in the Arab world. At the same time, also interestingly, Syrians established more than 1/3 of all new foreign companies in the first half of 2015 in Turkey. Again, to go back to the recovery part, I think it's important to emphasize also that there will be the need to have a transparent and inclusive process of recovery, unlike the Iraqi scenario, and also count on the resilience of populations. And we often hear that the populations are not ready. I think they're pretty much ready, and we've seen very well-functioning local councils in Syria, despite the war, despite the tragedy. I will just mention the local council in Manbij before ISIS took over, the local councils in Aleppo, which possibly triggered a lot of the shelling by the regime because these were very well-functioning councils which were distributing products and services. And again, the Eastern Ghouta, the besieged Eastern Ghouta, is also, you see signs of self-governance, which is becoming very effective. Interestingly, I've been speaking to young Syrians who are refugees in Europe who are helping these farmers grow their own plants so that they develop what they call food sovereignty. And Nadim will tell us about food security, but I think this is an effort also which is showing resilience. I will just end by saying we talk about destructions, of course, a very heavy toll, a tragedy which is unfolding. But it's, I think, important also to outline that there's been a paradigm shift and a revolution. I'll come back to that word, a revolution which happened in the mindsets, the way people and the populations relate to each other. It can have very negative, of course, dimensions, but it's also rethinking the relation between populations and populations, the state and society, definitions of identities, and also the place taken by the different groups within the societies, which will impact the post-war reconstruction. And interestingly also, I will just say that this term of revolution has also been sort of raised in US elections since yesterday. So it's back in the game, and I think looking at the reconstruction, hopefully there will be also a whole encompassing, inclusive process, which will take into account the tolls, the negative, the physical destructions, but also build on the positive dimensions that also emerged from the Arab Spring. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marwa. Next, we'll have Erika, who has a PowerPoint, so let me get up and not stand in the way.
Okay. Everybody can hear me, right? Okay, so I always like to start just to have visuals, because when you're talking about water, to have a sense of what water basins look like, but also some of the natural processes that affect the political. And in many ways, I'm going to be taking a broader perspective and looking at trends as they relate to water, but how water connects to broader processes of understanding the shifting nature of war that has taken place largely since what we call the Arab Spring, but where processes have begun even before. And then also bringing it down a level to the level of human security and looking at what Marwa also had talked about, looking at the impacts on human lives and the human condition. So often when we talk about water security, we often focus immediately on war. We think of interstate wars, we think of the major conflicts that are often in the news, often pertaining to the sharing of water between Israel and Palestine, between Jordan and Syria, between Saudi Arabia and Jordan, with the DC, the Jordan River, the Yarmouk, the aquifers. Those are the images we have of water security in the Middle East. What I'm going to do is move away from that and think about water security challenges that are facing, and again, this is the Middle East broadly, that are facing the countries affected by the Arab Spring, and looking at this legacy 5 years in and trying to identify what some of the issues have been and issues that we need to think about as we move forward. I'm going to start with climate change, and then I'm going to talk a bit about where I see how war has shifted in the Middle East, in that we're seeing a focus on not just targeting of civilians, but the targeting of infrastructure as a way to indirectly target civilians. And then I'm going to talk a bit about refugee flows and what that means for water issues, and then maybe move into a little bit more of the optimism, but thinking about how we go about using water as a mechanism for restoring livelihoods, for bringing about a revival in the economy, and then tying it back into some of the processes that are taking place at a broader level, at the level of the international community, in talking about the Sustainable Development Goals and what they mean for thinking about water and peace as part of the legacy of the Arab Spring and moving forward. So climate change. Just to give you a sense of how dry this region is, this is a picture of the Jordan River. What has been in the news has been that there's been a drought. There was a drought for the first decade of the 21st century. It was a prolonged drought that affected a large number of countries in the Middle East. Different countries were able to respond differently. Much of this has to do with issues of resilience, of their ability to adapt and to cope, if they're able to have alternative sources of water. And this is an issue that has played a very large role in Syria, in the conflict there, but also has affected the politics in Jordan and other parts of the Middle East. Just to give you a sense of what this actually looks like when we're talking about climate change impacts, we're talking about change in precipitation. So this is just to give you a sense, over the last decade, that there has been less winter precipitation throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Just an image from Syria where you can see consecutive years of drought. So in Syria in the northeast and also towards Aleppo, you had prolonged periods of drought, and there you didn't have a response to cope and deal with it. Even though there was an awareness of the drought, it wasn't linked to any of the political processes that scholars and policymakers have looked at in contributing to the conflict. People talk about climate change as being a threat multiplier, that there wasn't a link connecting migration because of the drought to putting additional pressure on a weak state that did not, a fragile state that didn't have the capacity to provide public goods or social services for the population that was affected by the drought. So moving to infrastructure, what I think is probably one of the more interesting dynamics that we're seeing in the Middle East right now. And here what I'm talking about is this broader process, again, of how we understand warfare. Throughout the Middle East, what we've been seeing is a direct targeting of infrastructure, the targeting of water infrastructure, targeting of infrastructure that provides for the basic needs of the population. So, you know, targeting sanitation sites. And this is just pictures of homes before and after. And this is going to be incredibly important, too, when you start thinking about rebuilding, to have visuals of what was there before, to understand how one can rebuild. What does it mean for people to return? Will they know where to go back to? So having these visual images and templates will be very important in trying to facilitate a rebuilding process. One of the things that we've been doing, that I've been working on a project, is trying to really understand this targeting of infrastructure broadly, because it's not something that I think is just part of the legacy of the Arab Spring. It's something that has begun prior, but it has been amplified during the recent wars in the Middle East. And you can this is just giving a selection of examples of where the water sector has been targeted, but it was targeted during the first Iraq War, where you had water and sewage facilities destroyed. Israel has destroyed wells in the West Bank. You have ISIS targeting pipes that supply drinking water. You have water bottle facilities bombed in Yemen. So there's a broad range of types of infrastructure that are being targeted, but this is really changing the dynamic again, because it's not just targeting civilians or cities explicitly, it's targeting the infrastructure that is necessary to maintain those cities. So you're seeing, in many ways, the urbanization, too, of warfare and tied to the water sector. So what does it mean when you target infrastructure? So again, this is targeting, you know, infrastructure that supplies electricity. You see, and also it gives images of how areas have been depopulated. You're seeing Syria going dark. There's less and less people there. There's less and less infrastructure. And what does that mean? In thinking about the humanitarian challenges in these parts of the world when the power goes out. So if you take it down, ratchet it down a level, we need to start thinking about the human security component of water security. So what it means is if you don't have pumps for sanitation, for providing drinking water, basically you have water, sewage, and sanitation flooding urban centers. You have contamination of surface and groundwater. You have a growth in waterborne illnesses. You have outbreaks of cholera, contamination of soil and crops that will then feed into providing food security, and a collapse of the public health system. So you're seeing tremendous health impacts. And again, these are some of the indirect impacts of targeting water infrastructure or electricity infrastructure during warfare. So moving to the next challenge tied to the water sector is this notion of refugee flows. There's large numbers, as Marwa talked about, refugees that have fled to Lebanon, to Turkey, to Jordan, and this creates other water challenges for water-stressed countries. So a country like Jordan is already facing its own water challenges, that it is a very water-scarce country. It doesn't have enough water to provide for its populations, especially in a city like Amman, where there is no 24/7 when it comes to water. You have the siting of refugee camps in Jordan, and often when you site a refugee camp, the first thing you do is you site it where there is water. That is not something that is very easy to do in Jordan. So what happens is you're it's leading to what we call this host camp competition, so host country competition with the refugee camps. So competition over water, which also means it has increased the prices of water for communities living outside the refugee camps. It has forced Jordan to look for alternative sources of water, to buy water, but it's also pushed Jordan to look to expand, to augment its water supply, largely through these very large infrastructural projects, rather than investing in improving efficiency if you're looking at it from someone who studies water management. So Jordan has been building pipelines to move water from the DC. It's investing now in trying to transport water from the Red Sea to the Dead Sea with a desalination plant to provide drinking water. Okay, I want to move on so I get through all 5 points. The next challenge that I would identify has to do with what happens when the conflict ends or when there's a cessation in violence. How do you go about restoring livelihoods? And where does the water sector fit in? At the most basic level, you need to be able to provide potable water. You need clean water, you need proper sanitation to make sure that people are not ill. And one of the things that we often overlook is that in the aftermath of conflict, because people are moving, the public health system has collapsed, you still see a spike in deaths. And it's related to the fact that there's this absence of proper water services. So this is, one other area where water had been targeted earlier was the targeting of the Marsh Arabs in Iraq. How do you go about restoring livelihoods for people who've had their lives destroyed? And I'm just throwing that out as a challenge and thinking about how one uses water as a mechanism for restoring livelihoods, but also thinking about what are the proper ways. Marwa talked about leveraging participation. Local, in conflict-affected zones, often you have informal water vendors. You have the informal sector providing water. How do you bring them into the formal process as a way to rebuild the water sector? And my last point is really this challenge of meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. This is where all the attention, a large amount of attention will be focused from the international community when it comes to the water sector in providing access to water and sanitation. What is really interesting about the Sustainable Development Goals is we have a lot of them. The international community is going to be focused on them. They're all sort of siloed. So we talk about providing access to water, we talk about providing access to energy, we talk about sustainable cities, but rebuilding in a post-conflict environment means integration and thinking about how sectors interact. And the other thing with the Sustainable Development Goals, where it will become very interesting to see, there is actually a goal for building peace and just institutions, or linking in this notion of peace and state fragility. How do you connect that to the water sector? How do you rebuild water institutions in fragile states or conflict-affected zones? And so I'm just going to conclude with this slide and thinking about, is the proper way investing in these very large infrastructural schemes, or do you really need to think about leveraging smaller, water infrastructural projects, more participatory in a post-conflict setting that really leverages what humans are already, people are already having to do at a very local level in trying to find ways to procure water. So I will stop there, and I just want to acknowledge that I do a lot of work with 2 other people who are not here today.
Thank you, Erika. Next will be Nadim. It should be on. Yeah, it's on.
Thank you very much. And I think I will build on what Erika and Marwa have presented, because it set the stage for the food security aspect. Of course, water is important for plants, and the whole destruction that Marwa talked about did actually address issues and infrastructure that is important for food production. So I will go straight into my concluding remarks, and then I will build up the case for that on a few things that are particular to food security. But I think there's so much momentum in what I wanted to lead to that comes from the preceding two interventions that, with their permission, I will build on. There are 2 points I want to build my 5 conclusions on. One is the fact there are the immediate issues that are linked to the ongoing conflict. And one aspect that I will be highlighting is that as we are waiting or hoping or based on the previous panel, almost not hoping for an end to conflict, what do we do? So my first point or the underlying objective that I will have is going to be what do we do right now, and what is the degree and the range, the scale of the assistance that is to come from somewhere. And the second point, as was highlighted also by both speakers, but in particular by Erika, by addressing overall trends, climate change, others, is that whether we consider that all of the Arab Spring revolutions were due to to drought and other issues, or we think that it was a contributing factor, certainly that a lot of the issues that we have to deal with now and that increase the scale of both the tragedies and the investments that are going to be needed to address those issues are only highlighted even more because of the crisis. But unless we deal with them, with some of these roots on food security, we are going to miss lots of points. So my first two concluding remarks are on the humanitarian and food security issue. The refugees, as we just heard, are contributing to lack of resources in the surrounding countries, and also the internally displaced. I think the last figures for Syria are about 7 million internally displaced, are also uprooted and need to be assisted. A few days ago in London, there was a gathering that basically agreed on about $6 billion to be pledged, that have been pledged by donor countries, mainly European countries, to address the issues of both internally displaced and in the host countries because of the Syrian situation. If history teaches us something, is that only part of that of these amounts will actually materialize, and as was said before, we don't know how much trickles actually down to assistance of locally where it's needed, but at least it gives one idea of the magnitude of what is needed because of the conflict. Now, the key thing is that in the agriculture sector, which in many cases is providing some of that food security, especially in Syria, that was one of the rare countries that actually was food sufficient, not only food secure, by producing its own food. It had some negative aspects, overuse of water and others, that if there is time we can get into. But certainly there, the agriculture loss is estimated at 7%. So that same study that Marwa talked about from ESCWA gives an estimate of that 7% of the loss is in agriculture. And this, in a way, provides some idea for the second point that I had to make on immediate assistance, which is there is a change, a shift that we need to apply to assistance when it comes to food security, at least, which is to see that there is a lot of activity still going on even during conflict, and to try and assist with the humanitarian assistance, definitely, but to try and see which rules we have in providing that assistance that we can facilitate in order for that assistance to go even during the conflict as feasibly as possible to those we are trying to assist, and to try and promote the local production of food as all the rest, and we are waiting for all the other bigger changes to happen. The three other points are linked to the more basic underpinning aspects of food security. One is on social programs. As we heard in the first panel, a lot of the subsidies, part of the social contract that was discussed, were and even are now more unsustainable. Just a quick estimate that we have from a study from IFPRI. Syria before the war and Egypt had about 20% of their public spending that was going to food and fuel subsidies. This is twice as much as was going to the social programs, all of them together. Issues with those subsidies is that at best they were unfair, because in general they go in the pockets of more of the merchants and others, and they are not targeted, whereas safety nets would be targeted. But in any case, whether it's Egypt or the Gulf countries, especially with the declining oil prices, we expect that the magnitude of those subsidies is so high that there will be a need to completely refocus them to where they are needed to serving the poor and their food security. Another area, and this is the fourth point, where the redirection of public investment is going to be needed, even as we prepare, as we are dealing with the humanitarian need, because in a lot of cases in Arab countries that do not have the crisis as as a conflict for the time being, but even as we prepare for the reconstruction and for addressing the present crisis, where there is conflict, there is a need to think about an increase, a revision, a review of the investments in the rural areas. The rural areas, many people even consider that one of the narratives for the present conflicts for the Arab Spring is a rural-urban divide. We hear about the rural people having moved to cities and having caused a lot of the inequalities, having shown more of the inequalities that are explaining some of the crisis and the revolutions. But more importantly, there had been, prior to the war, a whole shift from an interest in the rural areas and a concentration on areas of potential unrest, which are in the urban areas. One of the main points in food security is that probably none of the Arab countries, but certainly not the Arab countries in total, can be self-sufficient in food. And so a lot has to be imported. However, there is a very big gap between the potential for increased food production locally and in those countries, and what is now, even in the areas that do not have conflict, what is actually being produced. An estimate of the magnitude at this point is difficult to have, but the League of Arab States in 2009 had produced a quite an ambitious emergency program covering all of the Arab countries, and it was estimated to require about $60 billion over 20 years. That's one area on the magnitude. The last point I wanted to make is also on the linked to the magnitude as far as the food security issue is concerned, and that is a phenomenon that is also addressing the impact globally, and it's the tendency, especially of countries within the Gulf, the GCC, of accessing either through buying or leasing farmland abroad. That this gives a kind of assurance for them on being sure to be able to supply their needs by owning or leasing the land abroad. I think that here at the Wilson Center in 2009, you were leading in trying to see what is the possible impact of this. It wasn't only the Arab countries that were that had increased their purchase because of the hike in prices, but China also was doing that. And you were one of the first here at the Wilson Center to try and look at the implications of this. I think this trend is going to continue. We don't know what is the impact, but probably it's quite a large area that is now being discussed. At this point, some of the estimates are that we have about 2.5 million hectares in Africa alone that are being affected by this, not only by Arab countries. China also is a big player, and this could come back at the level of the Arab countries as a whole as an issue to address. Again, only brought even more in emphasis by the last 5 years, but it's more of the ongoing trend towards the need to secure food for a completely increasing population and decreasing resources in water and others. I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadim. And Richard, Cincotta, and I will get out of your way.
Thank you, Henri, and thank you for sticking in here to the end. I'm trying to show a few slides, and what I hope to do actually is show you something that was developed in the intelligence community. I worked for the National Intelligence Council, and it was done during 2006 to 2009. Why does one produce a model like this? Well, first of all, to simplify and organize. I think if you stuck from the beginning and listened to the talks, you can see how complex this is. And I'm not trying to take away from its complexity, but sometimes one needs an organizational tool to try to organize discussion and research. Secondly, we found out when using this that it works, that in fact, as you track age structural changes from the time when data were good, when in the 1970s onward, one can predict the rise of certain political events and economic trends based solely on age structure. Of course, there's variations, there are exceptions. When something like the Arab Spring, or at least the conflict in the core of the Middle East occurs, one wonders how you can adjust for the destruction that's been made. But that's a challenge that we may or may not be able to meet with this model. So why demography? Why do we create these expectations using demography? First of all, the data are very good. They're corrected every 2 years, and they're projected into the future. So for the next 20 years, we know with fairly, with a reasonable amount of certainty what age structures will look like in the futures, save for those where the population collapses and where there's enormous migration. But for most, we have a good idea. And we did for the Middle East and North Africa. So what I want to do is go through this with you a little bit. And so the question I'm going to look at is why such extraordinary costs? And I think at least that this model, at least that this model suggests why that might be. Now, what you're looking at is two maps of the Middle East and North Africa region, 2005 to 2015. And what the red regions are countries with very young populations. That is, if you can see down here, their populations look almost pyramidal when graphed in as a population pyramid or profile. And there's lots of young adults, there's lots of children, rapid rates of growth in the workforce, rapid rates of growth in school ages, a real test of institutions. It's a tough place to be a state. And when things fall apart, it's easy to recruit. And that was the whole Youth Bold thesis that was actually begun to be cultivated by some political demographers as early as the late 1960s. The brown areas are areas that have moved on. Fertility has declined, well below 3 children per woman, and age structures stop being pyramidal. There's an opportunity both for parents and for the state to invest in children. Many and almost all parents do, and when family size is smaller and when the cohorts are smaller, the state has an opportunity as well. Of course, some do better than others, but this generalization is what we're going to look at. And if you look north of this region, you can see Europe and parts of Russia where you've got another age structure, a set of age structures that are median ages over 35. The red area, the median age is under 26, very youthful. So what happens is that by 2015, this region has bifurcated. What we have is a group of countries that have remained youthful and continue to experience those stresses, and a group of countries led by Tunisia, also Turkey, where things have changed dramatically. So what I did at that time, I made 2 predictions, and these are published. And the first was in 2008 in Foreign Policy, and also in a Wilson Center journal, the Environmental Change and Security Project. The first said, the first and perhaps most surprising region that promises a shift to liberal democracy is a cluster along North Africa's Mediterranean coast. Expect 1, maybe 2 liberal democracies by 2020. And that was greeted with skepticism. One can imagine how people, I won't go into the details, but it was something worth projecting. At least it looked clear that something was going to happen, and if I went back all the way to the 70s and 80s and 90s, 2000, I could test this model, and I found that in fact it worked. but I just couldn't tell you exactly which one was going to be the first or how many. So it was, and that's its general problem. But nonetheless, in 2010, I sort of stuck to my guns, and I contributed to a National Intelligence Council exercise, what's called a low probability, high impact exercise. And then this one says, in this scenario, a North African state, probably Tunisia, undergoes a color revolution, a swift and nonviolent transition to liberal democracy. And that in 2015, for the year of 2014, Freedom House declared Tunisia a liberal democracy. Is it going to stick? I think if I compare it to other data, it's got a good chance, according to the, I've written a little something about this, just using the statistics and going back to experiences. And this was the big question: is the Middle East, North Africa region, like all the other regions which I could track, East Asia, Latin America, even Southern Europe, that had gone through this transition before? And now, this shows you what that transition is like. This is Tunisia from 1965 to, with extraordinarily pyramidal distribution, lots of young people, and rapid workforce growth, big challenges, to 1990, where fertility is coming down. It started as early as 1965. And by 2010, you have an age structure that we call intermediate. And by 2025, we have one that looks surprisingly like the United States, if that one comes to pass. And that's the UN projection, the median projection. So there is a political aspect to this. And I always like to mention Habib Bourguiba, who was, on one hand, ran a fairly rigid, ruthless regime. On the other, made enormous changes in Tunisia by putting girls into school, by guaranteeing them rights, and by changing a lot of things in terms of education and a whole broad range of reforms that undoubtedly had a lot to do with this transition. Now, I mentioned Bourguiba because this is the one graph, one set of curves I'm going to show. And the lesson here is that if you go through this median age, this transition from very youthful to intermediate to what's called mature, where the United States is, and South Korea, like that one. If you look at that, what you find from the last 40 years of data are that countries that are youthful have a hard job of gaining this status of free, and an easy, it's a little too easy to lose it. In other words, you don't get a real stable liberal democracy until you get to a median age of 26. So right here, there's a space for non-democrats. As much as inside the Beltway, we seem to love democracy, particularly on the right and the left. There must be a pragmatic center that recognizes that there's a lot of room here for some kind of partial democrat or autocrat, and I think U.S. policy has to deal with that. And that is, and what's the lesson here is that not only did we have a bifurcated change, but the U.S. and other countries have become involved in the most youthful countries in the Middle East. That is the core of the Middle East. And as we look out to 2025, at least with the projections that we have today, what we see is pretty much stasis in those countries. An Egypt that probably will not reach the age structure that Tunisia achieved in 2010 until well after 2040. I know that contradicts what some people said in their hopes for the in the first session, but I don't see, if this relationship holds, I don't see that Egypt has a good has a good bet for realizing very high levels of democracy. And of course, nor do those countries in the core of the Middle East or part of the Arabian Peninsula. So what is it that's going to be happening? And I have made these a few forecasts. First of all, look to the Maghreb, because it will continue to age. It will continue to move into this sweet spot of age structure, with possibilities of liberalization. I can hardly say more than that. Libya may have lost its chance. There are some things that throw democracy back, and one of them is conflict early in this stage. Another is ideology, and I'll end by talking a little bit about that. A second thing to worry about really is outside the region, is the Sahel. We have a condition that is very similar to that in Iraq and Syria, that is growing, almost festering in the Sahel. Very little fertility decline and lots of problems in trying to educate and provide services. And one can wonder what happens when that explodes, because people may go north and endanger what has been achieved in the Maghreb. I talked a little bit about Egypt. I'll just move to an interesting side note. Now, I know Robin said that Saudi Arabia's median age was 26. Well, that's if you include all the temporary migrants. It's actually much younger than that, 22, probably between 22 and 21. Nonetheless, fertility is declining in Saudi Arabia, and by, say, 2025, there will be some kind of change that may be very difficult for Saudi Arabia to deal with. This is the country that has stated that they want progress without change. I think that was the slogan. And that's going to be tough to pull off. So we'll just have to wait and see. I mean, the model can only do these general things. It wants you to look ahead. It wants people to discuss, and I think it works there. I'll just end by talking a little bit about the three things that the lessons that people have picked up from this model. First is that age structural change and the lack thereof are fairly good indicators of political opportunity and risk for policymakers. They can look into the future and maybe strategize, but the devil is in the details, of course. Secondly, there is an age structural time and place for liberal democracy. Not everybody can become a democracy. At least that's what the data tell us from looking back 40, almost 50 years now. So maybe we should strategize a little bit about how far we expect countries to go and what kind of autocrat or partial democrat we might accommodate. And thirdly, and this is a hard one, is ideology trumps demography. Everything I've said here is sort of is suspended when ideology comes to the fore. So countries like Iran, China, seem to bubble up through age structural changes, almost impervious to these conditions that are changing beneath them. In fact, their grip on ideology is a process whereby some countries are able to move back democratic gains, such as in Turkey. And that's important for for this region, because I think we've entered into probably a third modern grand ideology after fascism, after communism. This one has that broad width of application. It goes from the violent to those that try to find their way through the democratic system. And the Middle East is at the center of the growth of this ideology. And I agree with other people that it's just not going away as some people had hoped, it's maybe here to stay for quite some time. And with that, thank you for your attention.
Thank you all very much. I've been trying to figure out what kind of question I can ask, given, especially on the last very optimistic conclusion. I'm a little bit scared. But
Usually I try to end with, it's the end of history. It's a nice way to.
I think it's the end. But I just want, I mean, given all what you said, from your perspective, I mean, I want to start with the notion of reconstruction after these major conflicts in Syria and Iraq, etc. So we know what the problems are with respect to water. We know what the problems are with respect to population. We know what the problems are with respect to food security. Okay, so the wars are over, or whatever. I mean, we can pretend to be economists and assume that, make assumptions. And then, how do we build it? I mean, how do you go from all this destruction, all this violence, all this, I mean, when we talk about destruction, it's just physical. It's, as Marwa said, it's human capital, it's communities that have been destroyed. So how do we rebuild it? Who wants to start? I mean, there must be a political element here. Erika, you want to go first?
I'll start from the water side, at least. I mean, from a very, just technical standpoint, you need to think about what can be done in the short term versus the long term, and think about immediate human needs first, prioritizing those basic services, water and sanitation, but thinking about it more creatively. And part of a project that I've been working on with the UN has been to look at post-conflict settings, to look at lessons learned. And one lesson that I found to be very striking was the role of the informal sector, because during conflict, the informal sector flourishes. And it's often overlooked in post-conflict reconstruction because you want to have formal institutions, you want to have the formal economy, and it's left out. And it can be disruptive. So how do you bring that informal sector in to the reconstruction process? But then there's bigger issues about restoring livelihoods, the economy, thinking about food security. How do you work across sectors, especially if a country like Iraq has extractives? And that's a source of revenue. So how do you think intersectorally? But then over all of that is the largest challenges, which is governance. How do you introduce effective governance, which is important for both natural resource management, but also for politics and thinking about public participation, thinking about who has a voice at the table. Do you have to have women at the table when you're talking about sectors like water, where women are sometimes the main providers?
I think the technical side is very important, as Erika outlined. I mean, the reconstruction is about investments, is about internal and external stakeholders getting involved, clearly. And I think there are plans which are looking at institutional building, the agricultural sector, how to restore it, etc. So there are effective plans which are there. I think it needs to be coupled with the political process, and that's very important. And in that sense, there's been discussions among Syrians, for example, about the need for a similar Truth and Reconciliation Commission, like South Africa, to tackle really the roots of what happened the last 5 years and provide the possibility for reconciliation, but at the same time accounting for the crimes that were committed and by specific, entities, parties, or individuals. So I think a dual process like that, and we can learn from other experiences. And I do believe in the resilience of of the population. I don't know, maybe this is my optimistic side, but I've seen these young activists, women and men, who are outside, and they're in the age category of 22, 25, 26, but also older activists who are refugees, like have no means, nothing, and they're still providing informal networks inside Syria. And I mentioned this food sovereignty project, which I'll just explain it a bit because I thought it was fascinating. So this young man told me that in the last decade, the regime has had the habit of letting the peasants depend on the regime for the seeds, for the plantation. And Nadim, I don't know if you know about that. And so what they did was that they bringing back the seeds to the peasants, not just one seasonal, project, for them to have the ownership of the seeds, which they used to have and was taken away from them, so that they can be sort of owning their plantations, owning their production in the future generations. And they were able to find the seed which used to be in Syria and Italy, Italian farmer who had it, and they bought it from him, and they brought it back to parts of Syria, mainly, I would say, around Damascus. So human ingenuity is part of the process, and I think it's still happening. It's not like we need to find it. It's happening on the ground.
Yeah, I'd like to add two points on the day after scenario, which is the one that Ari, you asked. My impression is that at the regional level, if there is a day after that is really going to stick, we have all of the inter-Arab issues that will need to be seriously settled, or else, I mean, by definition, the war is still going on. And that one, I think, will provide a lot on the ideally, and now we are talking hypothetical and ideal. It seems to me there is so much potential of finding the financing and the facilitation within that, and then to address more at the local level, the community level, some of what Marwa and Erika were discussing. But it seems to me, if we are going to be realistic about a day after, then that regional component is going to be important. What type of solidarity will be there? The other point is, if we talk about what recent end of civil war happened in the region and what do we learn about it, I guess Lebanon would be one example where some level of reconstruction happened. There was no reconciliation and any of this, and there was, I think, by the admission of everyone, a kind of amnesia that everyone was forgiven for whatever they did, and the winners, the militias, basically are in control and took over the government. And there was so at this point, certainly from that experience, we can say that there is a depth that has been missing. And it doesn't seem to me that it provides a good example. At least it gave some respite, but certainly it seems to me for a lot of the kinds of discussion that went on in the first panel, we did go back, in the case of Lebanon, in the slow reaching of a true democracy.
You want to say something?
Yeah, I'll take one from the Ellen Leibson playbook, which is that after cataclysms like this is when countries have pivoted in the past. They used to say about the Marshall Plan, when there was resistance to it, they say, is it true that for development to work, you have to be attacked by the United States? And it may be, when as I lived my life after hearing my father say that, it was I saw Vietnam and Korea, and what is that about? It may be both sides realizing that this is a chance that they can't miss on, because there may be some political will and some extraordinary resources coming from the other side. And I hope that at the end of this thing that's exactly what will happen. But it will take a lot of energy from this side as well.
Thank you. Questions, please? No, here.
Thanks. Hi, Matt's a fellow here at Wilson Center. I had a very similar question to yours, Henri. And Marwa, you were talking about a new Marshall Plan. And I'm just imagining right now, okay, so we're in this scenario, post-conflict scenario. Specifically, what would a Marshall Plan, an effective Marshall Plan, look like? What sectors is it targeting? Imagine it's fully funded. I'll take Henri's imaginary guidance here and build on that. But where should we be prioritizing in that post-conflict environment, specifically for external actors? You've talked a lot, the panel has, about kind of indigenous things that would need to be happening in that reconstruction period, but from an external perspective, what would be kind of a couple key priorities?
That's you.
Okay, I think the Marshall Plan is a historical example, but it's also happened after a victory and a defeat and a post-World War II order, which was settled and stabilized, right? And it also happened in parallel to the emergence of the coal and steel community and the start of the European integration. We don't have the same phenomenon in the region. So ideally, if you have a regional integration in parallel and full peace established, and that goes back to the point that was made this morning, the region is still in turmoil. We still have the Arab-Israeli conflict. There's the conflict in Syria. There's a conflict going on in Yemen and elsewhere. I don't see the same context happening. But let's take the Marshall Plan per se and look at it as a potential. I think there's been like plans which are outlined. I mean, I mentioned the National Agenda for the Future of Syria, but you have also a lot of the opposition groups which are detailing reconstruction plans. And they're focusing on the agricultural sector, which has been hit by the war. They're focusing on institutions, how to build, solid institutions, transparent, well-functioning. They look at it from a government's perspective, but mainly also, I think what is very important is the inclusion of local actors, first and foremost, before the involvement of the external community, meaning it shouldn't be, I think the nightmare scenario here is the Iraqi scenario. After the war, 2003, the collapse of the Iraqi state, and suddenly there were like a lot of investments coming in, and, crony capitalism happening, corruption, some parts of the population privileged versus others, which created the sectarian issue in Iraq, in a way. And also, I would say, the rise of ISIS is also should be related to the Iraqi war, not only to what is happening in Syria. We have to go back because the Sunnis in Iraq felt completely marginalized in the process, economically as well. So I would say what should not happen, right? Not that scenario, but another scenario where you bring the participation of all the communities as well. I think this is another dimension. We have to get away from the sectarian narrative, which is sort of estranged for, a strange narrative for Syrians. Now it's happening, but it didn't happen before. So including all the communities in the economic and political reconstruction and having international investments, I think that's a good part, but it has to come, I would say, first and foremost from the international agencies in that sense. And possibly countries, but a diversity of countries. If it's coming only from one side, possibly the European countries should be involved as well.
Did you want to answer?
I can, or we can take questions.
Okay.
Let's do.
PJ.
Three quick questions.
Identify yourself, PJ.
Okay. PJ Crowley from George Washington University. Is Syria getting younger or older as a result of the conflict? This idea about local networks and institutions, if you look back to Iraq and Afghanistan in particular, did the United States get the priorities reversed? Building a national government where it didn't exist as opposed to building local structures and then putting an umbrella on top of it at some point in time. But in addition to lessons learned, where did the post-conflict process go wrong in Libya, and what is the role of security and perhaps even a stabilization force, although that comes with a lot of baggage attached to it, as you think through what will be required to prevent Syria, the conflict, from restarting?
Okay, who wants?
Me.
You start first, since it was.
That's an interesting question, but there's no patterns that you can go back and actually answer that with. If you look at Afghanistan, you would have thought, oh my God, they had this enormous conflict. If you look at the age structure, you can't tell that anything happened in terms of fertility. We know it went down for a few years, but you look at it, nothing really changed. And people say, well, what about all those men leaving? Well, during World War II, fertility rose in the U.S. believe it or not. Let's see. There is the possibility that if this country gets itself together again and pivots and understands the critical role that women play and are not held back by Islamism, which is going to be difficult, that it could get its act in gear. And that would have to be for Iraq too. When I tell people that these two countries, even though they had a substantial middle class, were very youthful. They had fertility rates Iraq's was over 6 before in the 1990s. So they just can't believe it. And I think, that said, Bourguiba got it, and I don't know how he got it in 1956. He probably got it for some other reason, that he lived with women when he was young, and he grew to appreciate them, and he thought that was he was a fan of Ataturk, who thought that basically you don't have an economy unless you engage women in it and in governance.
Erika.
That's a tough act to follow. So I'll start with Libya. I mean, I've been trying to get my head around Libya. I think it's a really tough case to understand, but what I always go back to was when we talk about, the states that collapsed as part of, the Arab Spring discourse, Libya was never really a state to begin with. I mean, it was a state in the juridical sense that its borders were recognized, but it never had those empirical institutions to govern. In many ways, Gaddafi had gutted the core institutions of the state, and it ran as a very much according to personal rules. So in some ways, what went wrong is really a function of probably trying to rebuild a state according to what we think how you go about building states when there wasn't really a state or the institutions to tap earlier. I'll just take the Libya one.
Anybody else? Quickly.
On the same question, I had the opportunity of talking with the team that actually was trying to organize the after conflict, the post-conflict situation in Libya, just after it all collapsed, so a couple of years ago. And they had said, basically, building on what Erika said, that it's mainly the fact that, including the UN, the external came with a set program of you do a committee that works out a constitution, and then 2 months later you do elections and things like that, and no one actually could refer to any of this within the tribal system in Libya. If I can just take the other question of local and what are the priorities with external and local, that same group that is working on a day after plan for Syria that Marwa talked about, I had the opportunity also of interacting with them at the Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. And what they have worked out is that the priority would be in those areas that provide economic growth, basically, and employment. In my view, not enough on the rural aspect that I was talking about, that is really maybe less on the growth, but more on getting people to work. But they have actually quantified the need that as these things are going to happen, and whether the 200 billion or others, the numbers are exact or not, certainly it goes way beyond the capacity to actually implement things. Because of this, the lag in time and others, there is going to be a large need for external assistance that in a way can be quantified at the global level. And as long as internally there is something to ensure a governance, that is the plan.
Just quickly, in Syria now, interestingly, it seems, I mean, you can't really say that the state has fully collapsed. It's collapsing. It's losing, the regime is losing ground territorially, but the state institutions, I mean, the salaries of the bureaucrats are still being paid. Of course, the regime depends completely on Iran and Russia to be able to pay these salaries. But there's still a sort of badly functioning, but still functioning economy, and again, a parallel economy. So there's not really a collapse yet. And then again, I want to go back to the point you made about Iraq having a national government. The problem in Iraq was that it was a top-down approach. And the whole point of the Arab Spring is to bring back the approach to bottom-up, people's aspirations, popular aspirations. And I think the political process that will bring an end to the conflict will determine the nature of the post-conflict reconstruction. If it's fully inclusionary, if you have all parties included, if you have women, men, but also all political parties and all communities within Syria, and then we can have hope that it would be a viable and sustainable period afterwards.
I'll take one last question here. Sorry, one last question. We already are, I was supposed to end at 5:30, so it was 5:37, so.
Thank you very much,
Quick
Henri.
question,
Yeah,
please.
yeah. Well, I would like to go to Marwa first. Thank you very much for this. You addressed very important issues and very hot issues, which show us how the Syrians are suffering. It's appalling, you're right. My question is, as everyone knows how the Russian and Iran standing by the Syrian regime. Marwa, how these two countries making this Syrian economy keeping on? I mean, in terms of banking processing, we know that the Western America are putting some restriction or embargo on some aspect in Syria. Nadim, regarding the donation conference, it's not only the European who donated that. The conference has been sponsored by Kuwait for the second time, third time, and the Gulf states have donated very good in that. Erika, you dealt...
Please.
sorry.
No, look,
Because
we have to end, please.
Okay.
Marwa, the question was addressed to you.
Okay, so I mentioned in my talk that Iran has, given credit lines to the Syrian regime, and that's helping the regime to pay the salaries and to sort of provide the basic, but mainly to pay the militias and entice the younger. I mean, telling them, it seems, the people to join the army, that they will get a guaranteed hot meal a day, and they would have a salary of $50 a month, which is very enticing in the current situation. So and Russia has forgiven some of its debt, so that's helping. I think here we have to mention Iran, Russia, but also the other countries, the Gulf countries, which are helping, fueling also the conflict on the other side. And all of that is providing for a parallel economy, inflation of prices, and also the collapse of distribution of services. So then we have sort of fragmentation at all levels.
On that note, I want to thank all our panelists.
Sorry. No, there was the issue of the funding. I just wanted to clarify.
Okay.
Yeah. I thought I had mentioned that it's mainly the European. I mean, of the 6 billion, most of it came from Europe, but you are absolutely right. For completeness, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Kuwait contributed in total about 600 million. Thank you.
All right. Please join me in thanking the panelists for a difficult, to say the least, presentation. And, well, thank you for coming to Wilson Center. Thank you, guys. This was great.
Thank you.
It will be.
Thank you so much. Thank you.